So welcome to those coming in. Let's be patient and give the others who are still joining a minute or two. I see people are slowly trickling in, but maybe for those of you who arrived on time, thank you. I think we can start already, and those who continue to join will surely catch up. So yes, welcome. My name is Emmett Kearney. I'm a Senior Water Sanitation and Hygiene Officer working for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. At the outset, let me thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support for this and other refugee wash projects in the past and ongoing. So let me show the program. I'm going to try to be as brief as I can as I recap the improved emergency latrine slab project. But there's a lot of detail in each of these project areas, so I'll really only be scratching the surface. And there's, yeah, we could linger on most of them a lot longer. So I'll aim for about 20 minutes in this opening summary. And then I'll moderate a discussion with myself and the panelists you see listed here, Esther Shaler from UNICEF Supply Division in Copenhagen, and Peter Bysted, CEO of Icano, also in Denmark, by lucky coincidence. And it'll be great if you can participate as well. So don't hesitate to put questions into the chat as I work through the presentation, or raise your hand and unmute once we open the discussion and we're making our way through these questions. I've put these questions up now just for you to be able to take a look at what's going to frame the discussion, even though I think, like the project itself, that there's a lot there, and these questions are just a launching point. And when Peter, Esther, and I had some discussions recently, we could have kept going all day. So without further ado, let me get into the summary of the project. So I know this is quite a diverse audience, and for those of you who aren't as familiar with the humanitarian wash space, I quickly explain what emergency latrine slabs are, although you can probably figure it out by now. These are used in the scale-up of basic sanitation services in rapid onset emergencies, displacement settings. I'll outline some of the history in a minute, and this project and the session will be diving into this particular technology. But I think the whole project and the work that's gone on in the project has broader lessons and issues that are relevant not just for those in the humanitarian wash space, and I think that's what we want to explore in the discussion. What was the project aiming to do? So we were looking to make an incremental improvement and facilitate this improvement. So we have emergency latrine slabs. These are traditionally, they have an open drop hole. Some of them have added covers. They haven't proved effective. So the main idea of this project was to add a self-closing mechanism. Of course, if you have an open drop hole, this allows smells to come out of the latrine pit. It allows flies to come and go. So there's a public health risk there, as well as just dignity and user satisfaction element. So what did we do in the project? There were 6 main areas. So from late 2018 until the end of 2021, we worked with a few partners. The core one was MedAir on market research, organizing, carrying out field trials, developing technical specifications that led to a market stimulation process that involved lab testing. And now there's a stock deployment and lesson sharing. That's part of what this session is all about. We formed a scientific review committee to report back to periodically throughout the project, and for them to approve aspects of the project, including the technical specifications. A lot of those on the scientific review committee come from the organizations listed on the right here, as well as other organizations and academia as well. But this and the next slide kind of outline some of the key milestones in latrine slab history. And this is something that's been a collective effort. You can see that a lot of actors have been involved in making these incremental improvements throughout the years. And yes, the idea of this project was to continue to push on a little bit. And yeah, the debate on innovation, if it's incremental or breakthrough, maybe we'll get to in the discussion. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants, as we've said here. One other piece of background for the project is, of course, that it's now the 10-year anniversary of the launch of the Reinvent the Toilet initiative from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One of the early investments they made to American standard, one way or another, led to the Satopan that Lixil produces. And this has become quite a successful latrine pan and self-closing mechanism that's used a lot in the development wash sanitation space, and was part of the inspiration for this project. So we're going to go through the first 4 main areas here, and let me start by jumping into the market research. There are a few main tracks to this part of the project, but one was to map the market, understand who's doing what, start to get the perspective of suppliers, understand some of the issues that they're facing, the challenges in production, some of the opportunities, all to feed into this market stimulation. One part was this mapping and review of existing products. We have a lot of these, but I just put the Dunster House latrine slab up as an example of some of the information we were trying to synthesize. And then there was field visits across Africa and Europe, as well as contact with Asian suppliers for interviews, again, to learn some of the challenges and to feed into the market stimulation requests for proposals. I've put a few of the more salient points here. Maybe one thing I should mention is I'm going to try not to read the bullet points from the slides. So I leave you to try to do that as I summarize and narrate this. So yeah, the market research, again, we could take an hour on that, but we have to move on. We go to the field trials. There were, yeah, this was unfortunately impacted heavily by COVID. This sequence of the project was supposed to be a little different. So this big field trial aspect was pushed into 2021. So we only had some of the user input that we could use for the technical specifications, but we still were able to have some. And I think there are interesting things to note and learn from the field trials themselves. As you're seeing here, there were quite a lot of latrine slabs and combinations of slab spans and seals sent to the field. Our partner Meta worked very hard to develop a testing and survey methodology using COBO, creating a training toolkit for the enumerators of our different INGO partners in Nigeria, South Sudan, and Zambia. Just to mention, in each of these locations, new latrines were constructed as part of the trials. So some of them were trial slabs, meaning that they had self-closing mechanisms, and some of them were control latrines, meaning that they had open pits. One note on minimizing the confounders is that we tried to, we followed the same design in the test latrines as in the control latrines to minimize differences in user satisfaction of the superstructure of the latrine itself. And we tried as best possible to have the construction take place at the same time. So you had similarly aged superstructures and pits filled at the same rate. So we have good data from Nigeria and South Sudan that I'll get to here. Here are the different manufacturers, the number of slabs tested. So in Nigeria, overwhelmingly, refugees stated that they preferred the improved latrine slabs, reduction in flies, reduction in odor. I mean, I think this was known going in, that the self-closing mechanisms work, but it was good to have some data. And then a lot of smaller bits that we can't get into on different aspects that were good, bad, and ugly. Going to South Sudan in graph form just to mix it up. Again, overwhelmingly prefer improved latrines. And again, a good drop in fly count, even if there were more flies in South Sudan than Nigeria. And odor levels, a bit more complex here. We can see that if there is, if there's feces present on the latrine slab or in the superstructure, you still have flies. So, but when the feces is invisible, you have an improvement. I think this speaks to the point that there's no technological substitute for user engagement, community ownership to maintain ownership and cleanliness of toilets and latrines. Buzzing through here. So the market research and communication with our scientific review committee, WASH practitioners and users led to kind of targeting what did we really want to push into this market stimulation, into the technical specifications. So in the left column, you'll see some of the feedback and the issues identified, and in the right column, what we worked on in terms of scoring points in the RFP scoring matrix. There was, hours and hours of discussion on the weighting of these different aspects and how to design the lab tests and the lab testing procurement itself. But just to summarize a few of the top points, obviously the main one, flies and smells, needed a good and effective self-closing mechanism that had to function precisely with low water use, et cetera, had to survive 10,000 uses. Some of the other key points to flag, users found that the latrine slabs were deflecting or feeling bouncy, bending. And yeah, it's completely understandable for people that are now stepping into a latrine. There's a large pit full of feces below them. You can get some hesitation, some worry, some fear of this collapsing. So we wanted to minimize the deflection for that. We did it before and after a thermal stability test, taking them to 70 degrees for 36 hours, letting them cool back down. Users also found slabs to be slippery, people in sandals or barefoot. So there were 2 tests there. Some of the other ones on this second slide, there were questions about recyclability or using recycled bioplastics or other plastics having ISO certification. So these were were baked into the scoring as well. Questions on UV weathering and sun exposure. On this and on the thermal stability between manufacture, shipping, and installation in quite remote areas. Yeah, the slabs can be exposed to extreme heat on tarmacs and warehouses or out in the sun before they're installed. So these are seen as quite important. And then at the bottom, the needs of disabled users, which Esther and Peter will be able to speak to. That was also a critical part. We wanted to build on the work done by UNICEF there. So all of this fed into these technical specifications, into the market stimulation, and a request for proposals. This is the timeline. Some of you might be wondering what all this means. An RFP is a request for proposals. This is basically UNHCR going to the market with a tendering process for any qualifying enterprise that can manufacture or procure latrine slabs to bid, submit their product, and the winner or multiple winners would be awarded a frame agreement. That means that UNHCR or other UN agencies can quickly buy their slabs in new emergencies or buy and stock their slabs to be ready for new emergencies. So this was put out. There's a couple phases I'll speak about here. There was lab testing and the award. Another one that we could go deep, but just to summarize, there were two phases. Desk was phase 1 and lab was phase 2. And yeah, these technical criteria were integrated into both phases. 11 bids were received. 6 included samples. Unfortunately, 5 were failed for not having submitted sometimes even any paperwork, sometimes complete paperwork, or yeah, not having submitted samples. Then looking at the technical requirements, 3 bids failed step 1. I think a couple didn't have self-closing mechanisms, which was an automatic failure. So 3 companies moved on to step 2 in the lab testing, which we'll come to now. And if we had more time, this is one there's a lot of videos and cool stuff to show, but maybe next year. Yeah, as noted, there was a lot of work that went into the technical specs, and then logically into the discussion on lab testing. We consulted experts in a few universities and kind of external consultants on plastics and slippage and other things to zoom in on the right tests. There were some non-destructive, some destructive. I'm going to buzz through a bunch of these here. The 5 self-closing designs that were submitted and tested. We don't have time to show that KK nags on the left here involved when the user stepped on the footrests. It was a pulley and string mechanism that had the cover kind of slide down, which was eliminated. And then the Dunster upper pan was eliminated because of some of the criteria in the desk review, that it wasn't going to be very cleanable. Anyway, we jump into the tests here, and just to mention, we also tested outside of the RFP process. We included Lixil's Sato slab, even if it wasn't eliminated, just to contribute to the broader project and learning here. So the pendulum slip test, this relates to the users not slipping. This was done with this pendulum that simulates one a barefoot and one a foot basically with a rubber sole. They're done dry or wet. All of them performed well dry on the shod foot, different degrees on wet. And then on the barefoot, again, they all did pretty well dry, although some were better than others. It was better. And yes, these pictures don't match up to the manufacturers, pardon me. And then again, some all not as good in wet, some the KK nag not as good by some distance. Drop testing from 2 meters to simulate as these things are moved in and out of on and off of planes, on and off of lorries, out to the field, into warehouses, having this drop. So we did the slabs themselves, the self-closing mechanisms, and the pans. Wide range of some things, no damage at all. Some were completely destroyed, preventing proper functioning, like the dumpster pan here. We get to the deflection. Again, this goes back to that bending of the latrine slabs. We did this before and after that 70-degree heat exposure. Yeah, an interesting range of results. There's a table that summarizes at the end. And you can also see that for this particular self-closing mechanism, the deflection exposed that the odors and flies would be able to get through there. I'll buzz through just to get to the summary table. Yeah, we can see that both without thermal testing and with the Sato and Icano perform better than others in terms of overall deflection and difference before and after the thermal testing. There's also a cold weather test that we did, and yeah, all of the self-closing mechanisms passed. This one, there wasn't anything to note. 10,000 use fatigue testing, one with a machine, but we also asked the lab to set up these cool mechanisms that ran for a couple of weeks, simulating 10,000 flushes. And yeah, like with the cold weather testing, both the machine and the water flushing testing, all of the self-closing mechanisms passed. Then on the pan slab connection test, this test was meant to simulate somebody accidentally stepping into the pan. It was a 50-kilogram load dropped from 30 centimeters. Endless discussions on how to simulate it and how to do it, how much was the right amount and all that. Again, different results from different manufacturers. But yeah, some interesting results. Some damage to some of the self-closing mechanisms and pans. On the drainage, lots of puddling on the more traditional flat latrine slabs, but Icano, because of its slope, did better than all the others. Aids for visual impairment, another one that was challenging to synthesize. Nobody did great. Yeah, another one that we could discuss in great detail. And the UV accelerated weathering test. Yeah, as mentioned, these slabs are exposed to the sun along the way. In principle, that once they're in a superstructure, they shouldn't be, but people can leave doors open. So this was simulating 43 days. I see I'm running a bit late, so I'm not going to go into depth on this plastics discussion, which is another one that was quite interesting, with all of the manufacturers using different kinds of plastics and different kinds of manufacturing methods. This is an interesting one that we don't have time for. Different kinds of tests that are done before and after heating. Basically, the upshot is from bottom to top, those are good to worse. And one question is, should we be using something below MDPE or really LLDPE at all? Yes, and then the strain graphs, another interesting one if we had a bit more time. So let's cruise towards a conclusion here and open up the discussion. So following the RFP steps and the lab testing, the result was that Icano passed both its spring flap and its silicone seal mechanism. So this spring flap functions as you imagine. The silicone seal, which you see at the bottom right here, is basically a sleeve that the feces and urine slip through. Right, so very quickly on conclusions and lessons, future directions. Another one that there's a lot more here, but I'll try to summarize, is I think UN tendering processes are complex and quite rigid for good reason. But if we were better able to support the capacities of suppliers from low and middle income countries, we could have avoided some wasted energy, and maybe some of the products that were submitted and eliminated could have been moved further along in the process. So yeah, one thing we had discussed was how the process as it stands at the moment is skewed toward Western manufacturers, and how once these processes are launched, we have to maintain radio silence with the manufacturers. So that's a bit of what we will discuss with Peter and Esther about how to work with the private sector and manufacturers to improve products and get feedback. Yeah, this is more of a question for us, but is there some way for field testing to be part of an RFP process? When we put our tech specs together, we tried to make user feedback part of the requirements, but we were told it was not really feasible to ask manufacturers to demonstrate that they'd engage with users, but we still want to pursue that. Again, I'm not going to read these points, but I think there's some things we learned from the lab testing that we want to follow up. We're not sure if we're completely tapped into the discussions, similar discussions with development actors in this space. Localization needs to be discussed further. We shouldn't just have these products shipped from China. And I don't know if I mentioned it in the market research part, but Lixil does have a licensing agreement. So there are manufacturers in some African countries that we spoke to who are licensed and producing satchopans, for example. And that was part of our RFP, but yeah, wasn't a pass-fail. More field testing, and yeah, just want to use everything that was learned and discussed and gone over here to continue to push latrine specifications going forward. That was a bit over 20 minutes, but hopefully I didn't go too quickly. Once again, here are the questions for the panel and for the attendees. So, Peter, Esther, if you're there, maybe we can come online. I can stop sharing my screen and we can open up the discussion. So maybe, yeah, before jumping to the more challenging questions, I take you in the order I see you, Peter, and then Esther. Is there any initial reaction, something that, yeah, you learned or was interesting about the project as a whole?
Should I start?
Please.
Well, to me, your demonstration, you have just demonstrated that a latrine slab is it's not just a piece of plastic with a hole in it lying on the ground. It's pretty complicated. And we've been working with this issue for 8 or 9 years now. And to us, it's a really, really encouraging thing that for the first time, I've seen it at least, there has been conducted a structured test and structured feedback on the different products in the markets. And we've been asking for that for many years. And it's difficult to get this feedback for many reasons. And we're well aware of that this area is extremely complicated to work with. And our product, our way of working with things has to go into a very, very complex world. So that's why it's something you have to be very patient working with. But I think this project is extremely encouraging, and I look forward to seeing the next steps. And we can come back to the idea of maybe succeed having a more open discussion with producers and designers and idea people developing new products in the future, maybe even in a faster pace that we've seen in this case.
Great. Yeah, happy to follow that up and try. Maybe Esther, an initial reaction before we get to our questions.
Yeah, so this project, as you said in your timeline, came after the UNICEF Innovation Project, which had specifically focused on, can we add something to the slab to make it more accessible for persons with disabilities? And I think for me, this project, seeing the range of add-ons, as we kind of refer to them in-house, the fact that we can not just have the slab, we can then improve on the slab by having the flapper. The disability add-on is a separate project, but they're very complementary. And I think the fact that there was the appetite for the responses says that not only, so I think one of the reasons there was the appetite for the responses is because of how well it was communicated. Using tenders and having kind of clear specifications makes it easier for the private sector to respond, because we've defined what we're looking for. And I think that seeing the volume of responses from the private sector for that, when it was well communicated and articulated, is promising to show that some of the stuff that we sit with as practitioners, if we actually spend a bit more time defining it, then the opportunity to engage the private sector is there. I think the bit and kind of what comes next, and I know I'm jumping the gun on questions, but you already mentioned it briefly, Emmett, is how we do that to support low and middle income country development, manufacturer responses. And I think that's the bit that it's one of those, it's a bit of a catch-22. Do we start with the bigger manufacturers and then work out how we can do it locally, or do we do it the other way around? So I think for me, it was just, the breadth of the responses was really encouraging to see.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. And maybe to stay with you, Esther, and to dive in, the first question on next steps to keep the momentum going in this space. I mean, you were working on this well before, and we'll continue working on it after. Peter had flagged an idea in his response of just having that open discussion with manufacturers, and maybe that's something we do, in the next couple of quarters, is a debrief and discussion. I don't know, what do you think to keep momentum going in this space?
I think it is that, and I think so for those of you who don't know on the call, I sit in product innovation at UNICEF, and we still operate within the UNICEF processes, but we have a bit more flexibility. So Emmett, when you were saying that you didn't know how to include field testing in your tender process, we've actually worked out, not a workaround, but we do have a process to incorporate that. So there's one product, we redesigned the high performance tents. Everyone in the sector knows the tents, they're pretty iconic. And for that, what we did was we did a tender to field trial. So everyone who responded to the tender and completed the technical evaluation on paper and the financial evaluation was then invited to field trial in 3 separate locations. At the end of each field trial, we could then feedback to the developers about how their product had performed, and there were tweaks allowed before the next field trial. Then, if they succeeded in the field trial, we invited only those products to tender for the LTA or for the contract award. And that is one way we've found to allow a bit of what we call a co-creation process. But it's really heavy and time consuming. It requires a project manager, me, to manage that whole process. And that's about a year of my life taken up with that. So in terms of the ability to feedback, it is good, but it is heavy. What we really want to see is the ability for country officers to say, well, this is what we need, or regional officers to say, this is what we need to respond to emergencies in our region because we use water for flushing or we don't, and then work with the local manufacturers to do that. We know that KKNAG, for example, use local sellers, so they'll supply directly to local kind of dealers, but that's not necessarily the solution. I think the next step going forward, one of the questions I have, and I'd love to know if anyone on this call has thoughts, is whether or not unification of the slab specs would allow us to have greater ability for developers like Peter and designers to then say, well, we know everyone's using the same slab, which is this length by this width and this thickness. Can we then get a bit more of an IKEA thing going on about having more of these add-ons that allow us to use the slabs better? That's one way that I think this could maybe go forward from a sector-led. But I do think, Emma, everything you said about having a good debrief, not only from the sector's perspective, but from the developers, is really important, because Peter and you guys have already mentioned communication. At the UN level, we can't change that. We're bound by the public procurement processes. But is there a pre-process we could have where we have like a play park and we have a regional consultation where developers can bring their prototypes and we see how they get everyone together and see how it feeds back. We do that in other areas. So yeah, sorry, I spoke a lot there.
No, that's great. And yeah, I'll go back to Peter on the same question, but maybe I didn't encourage people enough to jump in with questions in the chat or put your hands up. So don't hesitate. I mean, no question is not a good question. Be safe, feel safe. It's a comfortable space. We're all friends here. So don't hesitate to type it in the chat or put your hand up. And I also had quickly introduced Esther and Peter at the beginning, but maybe just to give a little bit more nuance, as Esther said, she sits in UNICEF's supply division in Copenhagen, works a lot on innovation, and that's why she's here. And Peter, yeah, is working, is representing the private sector, but as the CEO of Icono, and the company that won this particular tendering process. So yeah, maybe Peter, back to you on what Esther has said, or on keeping momentum in this space. Over.
I have a few items that I would think would be very interesting to pursue in the coming process. I do accept and acknowledge that working with the UN system is hard, and you have very strict rules and protocol for doing everything. But still, I hope that what Esther was saying about creating some kind of playroom or whatever you call it could be realized. What I was dreaming about in the process is that instead of going so strictly and focusing so much on a product, latrine slab is a product. So me, the whole process around latrines would be very interesting to address. I know there's tons of literature and tons of testing and tons of protocol for that as well. But I've been looking for years at the superstructures around latrines, which I find strange. I totally accept that the way they are produced with a local tarpaulin and wood is a cheaper way. But if you really want to improve the hygiene part of latrines, and if you really want to improve the accessibility for children that are not supposed to defecate around in the camp or in a village, you need to make a superstructure for a latrine that is maybe not attractive, but at least something that people would like to use, and especially children, instead of fleeing these not very nice looking and not very nice to be in cubicles. That's something that we would like to work on. We have been working on it in connection with a project we made 5 years ago called the child-friendly latrine. But unfortunately, there was not much success trying to promote the superstructure as an integral part of the latrine solution. So that's something that I would like to pursue on the concrete level.
And maybe that segues perfect to the next question, which I'll repeat. I took the slides down just so people can see us discuss, and we can see those that might be so bold as to unmute. But next question is, what barriers continue to exist for the private sector actors to work with WASH practitioners to make improvements and innovations to products and services? So Peter, you just mentioned the child-friendly latrine that you'd worked on, and the idea of a low-cost kind of IKEA-ish superstructure. And this is something we discussed as we were preparing for this session, and Esther has opinions on. But maybe to ask you, in that space, what, or more broadly, how would you react to that question? What barriers have existed, and what stopped you from engaging?
We never stop engaging ourselves for this. I think that there are a lot of barriers, of course, and we have to live with that. We have been made tenders for the EU system for years, and that's not in the least easier than dealing with tenders from UNICEF and UNHCR. So you just have to accept those rules, of course. But then that said, there is also I think the procurement part seems very separated from the other parts of the process, because in the concrete example with the improved latrines, it's evident to me that you cannot produce a quality, durable, UV stable and all that stuff product that is definitely much improved from products that has been on the market for maybe 10 or 15 years without having an increased cost, and especially not these days. And the procurement side has no notion of that. They are just going for the cheapest products by habit or by I don't know by what, but that's what we've experienced. So the contract discussions and the conditions that you enter are harsh, and more harsh than I've experienced anywhere else. You actually accept the conditions before you're even allowed to tender or to come with a bid. But that's a detail. But that's actually one thing that it makes it hard for companies to engage themselves in this area. We do it both because of our interest in it and also for from a business point of view. But it's not. I've actually tried to make a licensing model with a big company to produce our stuff, but they simply said no, there's no money in that. So we had to produce ourselves, which we did. And it would be more interesting if there was a balance between the proceeds that a company could get from this and the interest that has to be seen from the UN side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm now interested to get Esther's reaction to that.
Yeah,
Esther.
So I was just double checking while Peter was saying that. So far this year, we've placed an order for 4,000 slabs, which is actually quite low. Normally we're talking, 45,000 for one country in an emergency response. So at those volumes, if we go with 10% being accessible for persons with disabilities, or which is my focus on these add-ons, I admit, Emmett, yours is slightly different. But yeah, so we're looking at those high volumes of placing orders, and it's a globalized level, a centralized level procurement, so it's done through supply division. So the challenges we have with this are volume. And Peter and I have discussed in the past the idea of licensing out production. It's something I'm really trying to push, because I think we do need to look at how we decentralize our procurement. At the moment, we buy from a couple of key people, and that we've all seen with COVID and the Chinese borders being closed caused a lot of problems. But I think this is the thing. The problem with innovation, especially in the humanitarian setting, is we go from zero, where we're tinkering and developing and prototyping, to I need 4,000 of these tomorrow. And it's getting that business build. This discussion of demand is something we talk about no end in product innovation here in supply division, because how do we create demand for a product that the person who's using it actually gets no say over it being bought? Whereas normally we have a say over what we buy. So all rules don't apply. And this is one of the challenges around these products. I mean, Emmett, I'd turning the questions back to you. I don't know how you feel, but I sometimes feel a little bit like a fraud, that I'm the person who's making a decision on what UNICEF procures for WASH emergencies. I'm not using it. I'm not in the field, but I'm influencing that decision massively. And I have to trust in my process that I've consulted all the right people. But the reality is we're making that decision for the sector. And so I think the whole thing, like I'm giving such a diplomat answer here and not actually answering the question. But the point is there's so many other factors to all of this that we have to balance. And I think, in supply division, I do feel very removed and led by data, you know, the fact that I can tell you how many slabs we've sold this year that quickly, those kind of things. Whereas what Peter's trying to get at is that we should be having products that reflect the users and the reality in the field and the luxury of the time that that takes to get that product, and then the uptake side of it, because for it to be financially attractive for you, Peter, means that you need to be selling enough of them or selling them at the right price. You know, it's all these kind of economies of scale playoffs. And I think that's where, as a sector, we can't necessarily be more attractive to the private sector, except for the easy wins. I mean, how many chlorine tablets is one of the highest volume products we buy, but we're not going to innovate on chlorine tablets. There's nothing that needs to be done. How we use chlorine tablets definitely needs some innovation, because we're not doing it correctly in most settings. So this is the thing. There's a lot. I didn't answer anything. Sorry, Emmett.
No. That's fine. I mean, it's a discussion. We're not just looking for the final perfect answers.
Yeah.
There might not be. So no, the point about making decisions on behalf of people is a really good one, and I want to come back to that. But something that's connected to it, and I think is challenging on our side, is as you said, that we're talking about making improvements to products, and then we need a lot of them really quickly. Kind of zooms in on the issue that we've discussed previously on do no harm, right? This is the first and overarching maxim of the medical profession and of humanitarian action. But then it gets tricky in terms of testing products on displaced populations. Okay, there's ways to try to make sure that you're not affecting service levels. But yeah, it starts to take a lot more energy in emergencies where there's already not enough resources, funding, staff. There's other logistical challenges, institutional challenges, political, you know, take your pick. And then you're going to ask the team, oh, by the way, you also need to run a pilot project and engage with the community to make sure they're okay with it and make sure that we're not going to affect service levels. Try these things, get feedback. I mean, it needs to be done, but it's tricky to do. Part of that, what the original idea of this project was to kind of be ready and wait and jump in. I mean, so the good news is there wasn't a significant displacement in that, you know, those couple of months we were ready. So we had to do the testing in a more protracted refugee environment, fine. But yeah, I think those issues of how you do it, and yeah, then how you engage with the private sector actors and get the feedback is another one. So I mean, that's kind of taken us to the third point, which I think is another one that's quite interesting, is yeah, how to capture and how to feedback, how to make those small gains, because in the real world, when you don't have a captured displaced population that has no say in the services, if your app is good, people use it. If not, they don't. Your business works or doesn't. You make tweaks. You do your A/B testing, whatever it is. So how do we you know, move the dial in this space? Maybe I go back to Peter and then back to Esther on that. Over.
Yeah, actually, I would like to pass it on to Esther, because that's the area where I'm really humble. I know it's a huge area to work with. The only thing I can add is, and that's an ideal thought, of course, you have to think of making better latrines as an investment. That I'm not talking about higher prices. I'm simply talking about making better quality as an investment, because it's an investment in better health. That's what was our point of departure, making these projects, simply trying to slightly improve the health of children using toilets instead of using latrines instead of defecating around on the ground. And also the issue of dignity, I think that's important to promote politically. So health and hygiene and dignity, big words, but it's something that should be introduced into this area, instead of having, in my view, some latrines that when you take a look at it compared to other costs in the system, are simply left alone. Just air freight and bad logistics instead of building stocks and using sea freight instead of air freight is something I would really hope would be improved. I can see from the products that we send out that a lot of it are sent by air freight, meaning that our cost-pressured products costing, say, $1 would be sent out adding $3 per dollar in air freight. To me, that's absurd. And I know it's not easy. So on to you, Esther.
Thanks, guys. So the one on freight is a really interesting one. And I agree with you, but you have to remember in emergencies, we're often not paying for the freight in the same way. So we get in-kind donations from airlines and so forth, and we have agreements in place. But yes, but this is where, so Emmett's original question was around how do we get feedback to see changes in the products from the user. And I think this goes back to marketplace. You know, one of the hot topics in the sector at the moment is localization. Everyone has different views on what that actually means. So it's one of those terms that really does need to be defined before we talk about it. But if you have a product on a local marketplace, then that feedback has somewhere to go, because it means that people are buying it outside of the emergency. No? So like soaps, we can often put together good hygiene kits in country if we wanted to. That's a separate question, because we know that within the local market, there will be soap, there will be toothbrushes, there will be sanitary pads, because these are products that people are using outside of the emergency. So there, if we say we're to make tweaks on soap, we have a market that we can feed it back to that's not dependent on the humanitarian sector. So there's somewhere for the information to go. Then we just need to develop a system that allows us to capture that information and feed it back, ideally without doing it via the humanitarian actors, because they're busy, as Emmett said, with multiple kind of conflicting challenges. I have the luxury of sitting in a post where my job is just around innovation. So I get to speak to Peter and many other developers every day. Peter's had feedback from me as to how we've used his products, because that is my job. But as Emmett said, in the field, in an emergency, we're looking at doing pilots on top of a massive workload. So one of the questions is kind of how we manage our resources and talk about things like that. But on this question around feedback, I think localization is actually the key to this. If we don't have a product on the marketplace, then where's that feedback going to go anyway? Because whoever's got an LTA with UNICEF or UNHCR has that contract to supply that exact product with some minor tweaks for the next 3 years. So there's not that much room to make too many changes until the tender cycle comes around again. And so I think this is where we need to review it and understand how these products are used. But again, and Emmett, you didn't get time to go into it, but rotor molding versus injection molding was one of the questions on the slab. Rotor molding allows a cheaper mold, but injection molding, quality control wise, is the far superior way to go. But an injection mold is $100,000 plus for the volume we're talking about. So what small company in a low middle income country is going to have that outlay? If UNICEF were to provide money for that mold, we'd then own it. And that then sets a whole nother ball going of things. So I think the tweaks we need to, again, maybe it's a catch-22 that without the localization, we can't work out how we get this feedback, but also without having these products on the market outside of humanitarian settings, there's no market for them to make these tweaks. That was really roundabout, and people have put questions in the chat, Emmett. So if I'm going off on a tangent, I'm happy to stop.
No, I think that it's great as always. Maybe, yeah, it's a good moment, because I think it was kind of something I wanted to flag to Peter and you as well. So we have a comment from Vekiko on local production and licensing. Vekiko, do you want to unmute and share your question? Or I'll wait a second, and if you don't unmute. No microphone.
They said they don't have the mic.
That's perfect.
That's a great question, though.
Yeah, so, yeah, no, thinking aloud, that's perfect. So I think people can see in the chat this this first comment from Vekiko, and I guess that's a question to you, Peter. You know, as I mentioned, our market research had found that Lixil is already doing local licensing of the Satopan. What's your take? I mean, what's Icono's position? What are the cost benefits? Or how do you think about it? And when we talk about minimizing air freight, that's one solution, but there's a lot more to it than that. So
we're very interested in local licensing, and Esther and I have been discussing it. And again, it would demand a quite complex set of agreements and passing on molds to the countries, which would add to the cost initially. So you have to make quite a big investment in it, and so you have to accept that. You had to take a look at the actual volume of the products, and that's a challenge actually. One other challenge is that our products are made of some of the stainless steel, which are formed in a very high-tech digital engineered machine. And I haven't found any companies that can do the same precision, for instance, in Kenya or Tanzania or South Africa even. And the pressure mold, the injection system, the injection molding would be, as Esther said, a very good and cost efficiency when you have the mold, but the mold would cost a lot of money. So making a mold, sending it to license C would cost a lot of money. So again, volume has to justify that kind of investment. And I'm not saying I would not do it, because we are pursuing it all the time, trying to find producers that can actually make part of the product. But then again, the logistical side of assembling and finding warehouses where you could actually put the whole thing together. That's not that easy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's tough for companies to decide to make that an investment. You know, our market research saw that was kind of the impression from the plastics companies in the major African hubs, was that these weren't money spinners, as they said. And as Esther outlined, it's unpredictable, right? I mean, if usually they'd be at 30-some thousand this year, and we're almost in September, it's only 4,000.
Yeah.
You know, how do businesses plan for an unpredictable number of products? I don't have the answer.
Me neither. Only thing I can say, we have to build a stock to have a reasonable way of producing, and that stock is also something that costs. I've also encouraged at least UNICEF to actually do the same. We build a stock, they build a stock, and then they ship it by sea freight to save money and energy and climate and CO2. That's something I would put a pressure on.
Yeah. When you can have stock, that makes sense. But often, the stock's in the wrong place. It needs to be flown anyway, or and the case, the amount of displaced people is too much. I was just thinking to kind of wrap up the question on user feedback. I mean, Esther, you'd mentioned that there is a much heavier but possible process that UN agencies can undertake, and I think we kind of flagged one idea related to this on the next steps, keeping momentum, which is giving feedback from the field trials to the manufacturers, maybe with a kind of a closed door, another safe space where people can share their views and hopefully learn a bit from what we've learned. I'm trying to think a little bit beyond the latrine slab product and humanitarian sector for user feedback.
But I think that's the thing, and the slab in particular is a humanitarian product. Outside of humanitarian settings, it's not desirable. In any sanitation approach in development, we don't look at the slab. It's not something households buy necessarily, unless it's under a kind of displaced persons kind of setting where there's limited supplies. Generally, most households want cement and tile. So I think this is where, for this particular product, we have a challenge, because it's not an everyday product. It's not like soap. If we made soap, you know, there are options with soap, but this isn't that. And this is where, so the disability add-on that we have been using from Icono is ever so slightly different to the one that you guys have got. But the one that we have from Icono, one of the reasons this product is actually doing quite well is because it's universal. It's not dependent on the slab. The original spec was that it must be used, it must be compatible with the slab. But in reality, and Peter himself has done this, you know, it can go on anything. It can go on cement. Now that makes it a much more attractive product, because we can give it as part of our humanitarian response. But then as we go from communal toilets, where 1 in 10 is shared, 1 in 10 should be accessible and it's shared with the wider community, to household level toilets with identified persons with disability, elderly persons, whatever it might be, then we can move the product with it. And that actually has, this goes back to some of the idea that in the first 3 years of a major emergency, we get the majority of our funding. It allows us to do that long-term kind of implementation beyond just the emergency. The slab isn't one of those products. And in terms of sustainability, the slab is plastic that we can't necessarily do very much with, because a lot of the countries where it is don't have the recycling capabilities. So this is one of those products that, yeah, it's a brilliant piece of tech. And I kind of wondered if Andy would be here, because this is the thing. Do we accept that a product is designed for quite a specific setting, which I would say that the add-on, the slab very much is. But then what we do, the flapper, less so. So actually, should we be focusing on the flapper being universal? Watch this space, I might have something coming. And actually the flapper part of it should be able to fit with not only the slab, but it then should be able to fit with cement and everything else. So yeah, I wonder if maybe the questions are slightly wrong. Not your questions, obviously, Emmett, your questions are perfect, but the sector questions.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And you know, as you were saying that, of course, that the latrine slab itself is very much a humanitarian product, but as we can see, it's the pan and self-closing mechanism are picking up momentum and are being used in let's say development wash spaces. And I wonder about that interaction. Also coming back to Peter's idea about superstructures. Yeah, I wonder about the development wash space, if there is some potential opportunity for low cost, durable, good plastic superstructures that could also be used in humanitarian settings, but could be driven as the Sato pen is being driven in the development space. But we would need someone who's a real development wash person, maybe in the chat on the call to step in. But I think it's an area worth kind of exploring.
May I add that one thing, Jim? I don't quite totally agree with what Esther said about the squatting plate being only for emergency settings. We've actually tested in a small village for a year with a squatting plate with the silicon seal. And it ended up that in a way that the neighboring village said, we want that squatting plate as well. And it's actually cast with cement on the backside, turned over, and then it's a permanent, very hygienic surface that is being accepted. Instead of making a cast with cement and reinforced with steel, which is a heavy process for everyone, including cement, which is a problematic thing. This would just putting concrete inside the squatting plate and turning it over, and it's you have a permanent household latrine. It's a squatting latrine, of course, but still, that's the predominant way of doing it.
Yeah, so no, that's really interesting. And of course, it would be a step on the sanitation ladder. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, instead of people having more rudimentary basic sanitation.
Yeah, and especially the concrete surface is very bad seen from a hygiene point of view with hookworms and things like that. While the plastic is very much better. And it also signals that this should be kept clean, and the households actually lived up to that encouragement.
Very cool. We're a little bit over an hour, which I thought would be a good target. So that means we've been discussing, well, it depends on how long I spoke. I don't know if maybe I went over 20 minutes. But I think, yeah, on a lot of these topics we've just kind of gone over together, we could probably double click and dive deeper. But I wanted to make one last appeal for anyone attending to unmute, throw us a curveball or an unexpected question, make a comment. Or otherwise, I think we could work towards wrapping up. I'm waiting. Anyone unmuting? No. Okay. Last chance? Anyone? Maybe they're struggling to get the mouse and click unmute, which is why I'm giving them a little extra time. Because if you haven't spoken yet, you might not know where the unmute button is. No, nobody? Okay. Well, yeah. This was really interesting. I mean, talking to Peter and Esther, I mean, not my 20 minutes. No, it's always quite interesting to speak to you, and it was good leading up to this to have had a few discussions. I think there's more we can do here. There's more we have to do here for the populations we're trying to work to support, as Esther pointed out. So, Peter, Esther, do you have any final inputs or thoughts that occurred to you before I wrap up, tie everything together? No, Peter says no. Esther's just smiling.
No, I'm just curious how much is for the sector and how much, because again, and it goes back to kind of what I said earlier, you and I kind of nudge these projects in a certain direction, but without the inputs from, people on the call and the wider sector, how much is just our musings on what's interesting and how much is useful to those on the ground? And maybe, that's the next step, Emmett, that we do something joint together to show the work we've done and just check in with the sector that it's going in the right direction. Because yeah, there's a lot we could do, but what's actually useful is another question.
Yeah. No, let's connect. There's the cluster events coming up and then our events. So for sure, let's push together. But no, I now's the time when I should seamlessly integrate everything that was just spoken into a kind of summary. But in lieu of that, no, lots of great ideas, and appreciate Peter and Esther taking the time to join and to have reflected a bit ahead of our session, and to think out loud and yeah, to be open to exposing some of the challenges we're facing and issues with our own our own institutional constraints. So great, thanks a lot. Thanks to all those who attended, and I wish you a great day, a great rest of your World Water Week. Thank you. Bye-bye.